Ordinary summit of the heads of state and government of SADC wrapped up in Namibia at the weekend with calls for countries to deliver on infrastructure development promises. And to discuss this further now, we're joined by Mail and Guardian Africa editor Simon Allison, who's watching the process very closely. Simon, good morning.
Good morning.
And thanks for your time. Well, just looking at that, yes, calls for countries to deliver on the promises for infrastructure development, sustainable development, promises of youth empowerment, quite a bit coming out of this. But I suppose the question to ask is, with all of these summits, does SADC actually deliver, and does it have the capacity to deliver on what seem like big promises? Yeah.
Well, you know, at the beginning of my career, sort of 7 or 8 years ago, I used to attend SADC and African Union summits quite religiously. I don't attend them anymore. And the reason is that there are a lot of big promises, a lot of talk, and very little action on the things that really matter. And I think the big issue at this SADC summit was actually the Zimbabwean election and how the region was going to handle that. And what we have seen is a sort of ringing endorsement of the electoral process and of President Emerson Mnangagwa's supposed victory in that election, despite the fact that there is a constitutional court challenge over the results of that election, and any sort of impartial observer has been able to see gross irregularities in the vote. So what we have once again is a sort of SADC rubber stamping unusual electoral practices in a regional country, and I think that is a grave area of concern.
And that would be, and then again leading to the question, every year we have the calls for them to go on home and sort of make sure that we deliver the things that we've spoken about or that they've spoken about here. Just looking at what they have promised, again, infrastructure development, promise of youth empowerment and to deliver sustainable development through integration. I mean, are these things that they've spoken about before? Are these things that have come up before? And have we seen anything actually happen from one year to the next?
You know, there has been, all these conversations have been had, and these very wishy-washy sort of, very few specifics. What exactly does youth empowerment mean? How exactly are we going to deliver that? And meanwhile, we're kind of ignoring the bigger political issues that are plaguing the region. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous from SADC leaders to be making these big promises without really tackling the difficult questions.
Well, I'm very interested in one thing that I see here, the summit approving the operationalization of the SADC University of Transformation, a virtual university. That's very interesting.
It does sound interesting. It's going to be an online university, but again, very few specifics on what this means. And then we have a lot of good universities in the region already that maybe could do with more support rather than start trying to sort of reinvent the wheel. So I'm a little bit curious about how this is going to play out and if it's ever going to become actually operational.
Will it actually happen? Yeah. And then also the tripartite free trade area, the TFTA agreement. What do we know about that? What is it supposed to do?
So the tripartite free trade area is actually, it's with a couple of other regional blocks, and it's meant to create a sort of free trade area that straddles the whole of Africa. However, that's kind of been superseded in recent months by the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is this idea that sort of we're going to open borders across the whole continent and allow for free movement of goods and people. A very good idea, and it was sort of signed into continental law in Kigali earlier this year. But again, there's a lot of work to be done before it's fully implemented. But that is a sort of, these trade issues are really where I think regional organizations can make the biggest difference. Removing trade barriers, making it easier for people and goods to move across borders. And that will have a far greater impact on youth empowerment than any other youth empowerment initiative.
Yeah, and probably that and the virtual university, if and when it happens, and if it works properly as well. Food production in the region, and we know that this is a major problem, food insecurity. Were there any tangible sort of decisions or measures put in place or suggestions that came out of this?
You know, there's always lots of good sort of technical ideas, but again, the region likes to separate the politics from other things, and yet we cannot do that. And I think Zimbabwe is again a great example. Zimbabwe was a pretty strong food producer until its political problems got in the way of that food production. And now I'm worried again that if we don't address political issues in Zimbabwe meaningfully, that's going to have an impact on food production. So as much as we can talk about, you know, how to plant better crops and what seeds to use, that's all fantastic. We also have to deal with the big picture stuff, and I don't think SADC leaders are doing that.
Why though?
You know, we have a sort of, it's almost like a sort of, you know, the mafia have their omerta, where they don't talk about anything. We kind of have something similar in the region where we don't like to criticize fellow
Just
leaders.
glaze over the issue.
We like to just sort of accept that everything's all fine. And it really is a culture that's become entrenched over the last 20 years. You know, Thabo Mbeki's very famous silent diplomacy. We all know about that. The whole sort of the way it operates is this: we don't actually talk publicly about any of these serious issues. And I'm very worried about what this means, not just for places like Zimbabwe, where we're seeing it play out, but the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is also a SADC member. It's coming up for some very contentious elections in December. And there's a lot of fears that the government might rig them, that the sort of what's happening with the opposition. And the message that SADC is sending to leaders that want to commit electoral irregularities is that's okay. We're not going to say anything. We're not going to call you up on bad behavior. And it's a very different message that other regions are having. Like in West Africa, the region ECOWAS played a huge role in getting rid of Yahya Jammeh, the Gambian dictator, when he wanted to stay in power and fiddle the results of the elections because they took a much stronger stand.
Okay.